This, obviously, as you all know, yesterday this festival started in very great style, being opened by Her Majesty the Queen. So it sort of seemed fitting that having opened in royal hands, we should end on a royal note. I'm delighted to have a panel today to discuss that eternal source of fascination, mystery, intrigue at every court, really, going all the way back to the ancient whenevers, which is the favourite. And how to rise at a royal court. And I could not have a better panel for all this. I have to start by actually introducing myself. I'm Robert Hardman. I've just written a biography of the King. I wrote biographies of Charles III, The Inside Story. On my left, I've got Dr. Helen Castor, who's just written The Eagle and the Heart, and I'm going to get them to explain their respective courts in 1 second. We've got Lucy Hughes-Hallett, who's just written The Scapegoat, and Somerset, who's just written Queen Victoria and Her Prime Ministers. And if we're talking about favourites, well, you will all have seen The Favourite, a multi-award-winning film written by Deborah Davis. So I really think we are in the best possible shape. But I'm going to ask each of my panellists to start by describing the court that they're going to talk about today, what it is, what fascinated them about it, and then we'll come on to the favourites in a minute. But Helen, if I could start with you, just explain what was it like at the court of well, you pick your monarch first and then settle on a court.
The two kings I've written about in my book are Richard II, whose badge was the very beautiful white hart, and forgive me, Henry IV, who was described quite often as the eagle at the point where he came back to take the throne from his cousin. He deposed him in 1399. So what I wanted to start by saying was that if we go back to the medieval world, and I'm talking here about late 14th century England, it becomes quite important to distinguish a favourite from some other words or descriptions that we might use, from a friend of the king, because kings were allowed to have friends. And one of the very striking things about Henry IV, the eagle of my title, is that he had a striking number of very close friends. He made friends throughout his life, none of whom ever caused him a problem as king. A favourite is also, in the medieval world, not an advisor, because kings need advisors. This is a period of personal rule, and therefore the king's decision is going to dictate what happens in the kingdom, and therefore he needs to take proper advice about what will be in the interests of the kingdom. And a favourite is also not straightforwardly a mistress, because it is understood in this period that a king may need or want diverting female company, and that's a category into which I would also tend to put, if we go a little bit further forward, Elizabeth I's favourites. That is, she very much liked handsome men around her. But the definition of favourite that I'm about to come to with Richard is someone who is so close to the king that he, in this case he, starts to interfere with the proper functioning of the king's duties. It was the king's responsibility to rule in the interests of the whole realm, to uphold the law and to protect the interests of his people. And in Richard II's case, one of the young men he'd grown up with, Robert de Vere, the Earl of Oxford, who was a glamorous 5 years older than the young King Richard, very quickly came to take up a position where it seemed to everyone else around them that actually Robert de Vere's interests were taking precedence in Richard's mind over the interests of the kingdom as a whole and over the law itself.
We'll come on to his sort of how he became a favourite in a minute, but just the court of Richard II. I mean, what sort of atmosphere was it? Was it a sort of? I mean, he was obviously very young when he started. So
he was very young when he started, and that meant it was a deeply divided court because Richard became king when he was 10. So in that sense, though there may be the magnificent ceremonial of the court around the king, clearly it is not a normal situation in the sense for the Middle Ages of the men around the king helping him to govern. And what happened as Richard got older was he looked outward from his gilded cocoon in which he'd been brought up and decided that the great nobles who had been beyond that cocoon, desperately trying to keep the show of government on the road, were in fact infringing upon what Richard thought to be his rights as king. So it was very, very divided, very magnificent, but very divided.
Okay,
court.
very divided court. Lucy, tell us about the court that you're going to illuminate today.
Okay.
Where are we historically? We've moved on a couple of hundred years, right?
We're in the early 17th century, and I'm going to be talking about the Jacobean court, which is again extremely divided for the good reason that King James was the King of Scotland for a long time before he became the King of England. And I mean, Sir Richard became king pretty young. King James had been King of Scotland since before he could walk or talk. And he'd had an absolutely terrifying childhood. His father was murdered, Darnley. His mother, Mary, Queen of Scots, was driven from her throne, fled to England. He didn't see her again before, 20 years later, she was executed. So he was brought up under virtual house arrest in Stirling Castle, from which people kept trying to kidnap him. I mean, he was subjected to these absolutely mind-bogglingly awful scenes as a small child. He was in the room when his grandfather was murdered before his very eyes. And he was being beaten and abused by his tutor, George Buchanan, great scholar, but extreme anti-monarchist, who took great delight, as he explicitly said, in whipping the king's arse. And so James grew up very nervous. Skip forward, he becomes King of England by this time, mature and more confident, married. He comes south, and by this time he's married. He gets his wife, Queen Anne of Denmark, pregnant 7 times. Only 3 of the children live beyond infancy. But it's very well known to the inner circles at court that the people he loves, because of course marriage isn't about love on the whole, it's about dynastic unions if you're a monarch. And the people he loves are men. And he has had a number of favourites, and the one I'm going to talk about is the father of the Duke of Buckingham, who lived in this house, who was the second Duke, and I'm going to be talking about the first Duke, with whom James fell passionately in love.
Excellent. Well, all roads lead to Cliveden, as we know. Anne, now poor Anne, I'm going to trouble her to talk about 2 courts, because you've written many great biographies, Anne, but maybe you could talk about your namesake first, and then give us a flavour of Victoria as well.
Yeah, yes, because I did write a biography of Queen Anne, and of course Deborah's wonderful film was very enjoyable on that basis. And so, Queen Anne is, it's not a very glamorous court. She wasn't a very glamorous figure. She was very in very bad health and very overweight and sort of infirm generally. But she has these female confidants, and the first of whom was the Duchess of Marlborough, Sarah, Duchess of Marlborough, who is a much more glamorous figure than and Anne, as a princess, was clearly really in love with Sarah, and whether or not it was a lesbian relationship.
Well, we'll come on to the sex in a minute. Don't worry, I've warned them all. There's got to be some sex further down the line. But the court itself. I mean, obviously you've got that the sort of rather haunting mood that hangs over Anne, of course, which is that all her children never lived to adulthood, which must have made it a pretty gloomy court. But give us a flavour of the sort of I don't know, when it was at its happiest, or at its most vital.
Well, I'm not sure. I mean, it was a pretty sort of dull court actually, because I don't think that's the sort of point of the whole thing. But she a lot of the time was sort of literally sort of bedridden and.
And I'm putting you on the spot because I want you to talk about Victoria as well. But I mean, her reign is so long that her court has many manifestations. But perhaps you could just give us a flavour of sort of when we're into favourites territory. What sort of a court is Victoria's like?
Well, again, I mean, the reign is sort of divided into the years when she's married to Prince Albert. I mean, there's a year or two when she's a single woman, but and then everything revolves around Albert until his early death, sort of thing, and then afterwards, I mean, she's in deepest mourning. But, you know, she then does develop this rather extraordinary relationship with John Brown.
Right. Well, we'll come on to that in a second. And Deborah, although Anne has sort of described the court of Queen Anne, but I think for a lot of us, our image of the court of Queen Anne will come from your wonderful film, nominated for an Oscar, won a BAFTA, won pretty much everything. When the court that we see in the film, for you, what was if you had to use one adjective to describe that sort of court you're trying to paint, what was it?
Gosh, can't think of a single adjective.
You're allowed a few.
I suppose for me, the way I approached it was that there were two phases of Anne's court, and the first phase was during the reign of Sarah, Duchess of Marlborough, because she ruled the Queen. And that was the pinnacle of British success against the French when Sarah's husband, the Duke of Marlborough, won his first extremely famous battle, the Battle of Blenheim. And as a result, Sarah's stock was so high that Anne, the Queen, made a gift to her of a palace. So she gave her girlfriend a palace, which is fairly unusual, and will demonstrate the passion that she felt for the Duchess of Marlborough, who became a duchess during Anne's reign.
Okay.
And then we shift to the new favourite. And for me, the drama of this story was that Sarah introduced her young cousin, impoverished Abigail Hill, to the bedchamber to be a bedchamber woman, which is kind of a very lowly position, and didn't notice that very slowly Abigail crept into the Queen's affections, and it becomes a sort of a bedchamber story of how the whole court got turned upside down, and not just a favourite being replaced by another favourite, but a political establishment which was toppled by, the Whigs were toppled by the Tories as a result of this shift of favourites. And of course, the Duke of Marlborough being sacked and the Treaty of Utrecht being negotiated, which brought the War of the Spanish Succession to an end. So for me, it was very glaringly a court about the rule of a favourite being replaced by the rule of another favourite.
Well, I think what we're sort of getting from all of these, the courts where favourites thrive, and we're about to come on to those favourites in more detail, but they're divided, turbulent courts. They're not settled. The one I'm going to talk about, because it's a sort of specialist subject, is the court of Elizabeth II, where it was all, I would say, relatively stable. And I'm not going to be bringing much sex into that part of the equation, because she did have some favourites, but it was all very above board, and we'll come on to that later. Helen, let's go to your favourite. Let's cut to the chase. Tell us, paint a picture of him, and what was the sort of magical quality he had that captivated the king? He was a rather prissy sort of person, wasn't he?
The king was a rather prissy sort of person. I think everybody else at court at the time would say they had no idea why Robert de Vere had captivated his affections. As I say, there was a group of young men, young noblemen, who were put into the royal household, into this gilded cocoon, as I've described it, to be Richard's companions as he grew up. And de Vere was among the oldest of them. He was from a very ancient earldom. The earldom of Oxford was a very, very old title, but not a very rich one. But he was 5 years older than the very young Richard. And it is clear that Richard, who had an overwhelming sense of his majesty, the unique authority that God had vested in him, but the one person whose interests he would put before his own, to whom he would defer, was De Vere. There's a chronicler writing in France during these years called Jean Froissart, who met Richard a couple of times and was in England during the 1360s, and he has various comments about this. He says De Vere was Richard's whole heart, and that if De Vere said black was white, Richard would not contradict him. So it becomes, as they grow into their teens and De Vere's coming into his 20s, it is clear that he has the king's ear, and what he seems to be doing is dripping poison into it about the great nobles a generation older who are actually trying to run the government.
Okay. Lucy, tell us about, well, he's the subject of your great book. Tell us about your favourite.
Okay, George Villiers, the handsomest man in Europe is what they said. And he was initially famous mostly for his legs, which were apparently sensationally beautiful. And some of you may have seen the portrait in the National Portrait Gallery by William Larkin, where, I wish I could show it to you actually, but if you look at the distance from his knee to his waist, you can see that these legs, as portrayed by Larkin, are such that no human being could ever actually have been that shape. But a portrait painter, if he wants to get on in life, gives the sitter what the sitter wants. And Buckingham, I'm calling him Buckingham, of course he doesn't get that title until a bit later, but let's keep it simple. Buckingham was known for his legs, and the Jacobean court was a very good platform on which a person whose main asset was his lovely legs could display that asset. Because absolutely the centre of the court's sort of life, that's ceremonial, were the masks, which were very peculiar entertainments which were also actually sort of symbolic celebrations of the institution of monarchy. And everyone took part. I mean, in the great masque that took place in Whitehall Palace at Christmas, the Queen would dance. The King didn't dance because he was congenitally lame, but he would be sitting on his throne watching, and in a sense, the King watching the masque was an essential part of what other people were watching. He was part of the spectacle. But the princes danced, the Queen danced, privy councillors danced. I mean, people, that they rehearsed for these masques for weeks on end. You wonder who on earth was running the country in that time. But Buckingham was one of a group of performers who were known as the high dancers. And these were very athletic, handsome young courtiers who would kind of steal the show. The dancing always came at the very end of the masque, which could be extremely long. I mean, there was one on record which lasted for 5 hours. Gosh. So you had to sit through some clowning, and then through some very high-minded, quite tedious speeches written by Ben Jonson, and then at last came the dancing. And the climax of the display of dancing came when the high dancers stepped forward. And all of the high dancers were very skilled, but Buckingham had a superpower which none of the others had, in that when the others leapt in the air, they would go up, and exactly as would happen with you or me, when they reached the top of their leap, they had to come back down again. But we have the word of the Venetian ambassador that when Buckingham leapt up into the air, he stayed there. And while airborne, he would caper like a young goat. So he caught the king's eye, unsurprisingly. And the king was very susceptible to, the charms of handsome young men. And Buckingham became very rapidly his favourite. King James was lonely. His previous favourite, the Earl of Somerset, had fallen from grace, and Anne has written an excellent book about how that happened, which is her story, but I'll just give you very quick précis. Somerset had been found guilty of murdering his best friend, along with his wife. The wife was definitely guilty, whether Somerset was or not, historians still argue about. But the instruments of the murder were a combination of witchcraft and poisoned custard tarts. So the king obviously had to distance himself from Somerset. He was lonely, and along comes this fabulously beautiful young man who had fantastic legs, dancing skills, and I think this is very important, very good manners. Never underestimate the power of good manners.
Okay, well, we'll come on to how Buckingham made the most of those legs for a power grab a little later on. But to keep it chronological, maybe I'll go to Deborah and then to Anne. But Deborah, you've touched already on Sarah Churchill, but just explain how the two favourites in your film, how is it that they what is that ingredient that captures Queen Anne that makes her think, ooh?
Well, Anne grew up with Sarah at the court, at her uncle's court, Charles II's court. And Sarah was 5 years older, and she was sensationally beautiful, and she had the strongest character ever. She tried to get her mother kicked out of the court because the mother was limiting her ability to enjoy herself. And Anne was in awe of her. And they were like sisters. And I think that is similar to the story you were telling, that they grew up in a spirit of complete equality. And in fact, more than that, I think that Sarah was the leader and Anne was the follower. Not only was she 5 years younger, she wasn't as clever. And she didn't have Sarah's confidence. And as they grew up, Sarah grew up into become probably the most beautiful woman of the court. And there are various descriptions of her blonde hair shining like the sun around her head. And Anne was in complete thrall to her. And Sarah married extremely well, and she married for love. She married John Churchill, the future Duke of Marlborough, who was the greatest general probably in our history, and of course his descendant, Winston Churchill, wrote the great biography of Marlborough, which you've all got to read if you haven't. So she made the most brilliant marriage, and she created Anne's court because the war against France and Louis XIV began, and the huge military successes of Blenheim, Ramillies, Oudenarde, if that's how you pronounce it, Malplaquet, brought extraordinary military and cultural and success in every sense. So this was, in my view, the most glamorous court in terms of achievement. And Anne was in the shadow of that, but she was lucky. She chose her advisors well because she chose her favourite well. And unfortunately, in my view, she then went on to be captivated by someone who was prepared to spend a lot of time with her, because as she became more and more unwell and physically unwell, she couldn't really move around. And Sarah was kind of busy. She was busy building Blenheim Palace and falling out with Vanbrugh. She fell out with everyone, Sarah, including most of her children. And so Abigail found this little niche. And she crept into
Abigail
her.
is a distant cousin, isn't she?
I think
cousin,
there is something like a second cousin. Yeah. Or, she's a cousin. And Sarah introduced her to the court. She was penniless. Sarah supported her. She clothed her. She educated her little brother. She introduced her to the court, and she crept into the Queen's affections. And the reason I became involved in this story is that there is a very, very important line in Sarah's memoir where she said, I had no idea what was going on, but in less than a week, I found out that my cousin Abigail had become the absolute favourite. And it sent a shiver down my spine, because you could see that the balance of power was going to shift, not only emotionally and psychologically, but politically and militarily. And the whole of the court was going to be transformed by this shift in an emotional relationship. And so that's why I wanted to write this film.
Wonderful. Anne, if we come on to Queen Victoria, by now we're into the realms of constitutional monarchies, so the sort of scope of favourites is slightly different. But obviously you've written about Victoria and her prime ministers. Maybe nominate a favourite on that score, and then she's obviously got, as she gets older, this sort of rather colourful cast of characters who in her private world. So
yes, well, I mean,
pick one out.
At the start of the reign, her relationship with her first Prime Minister, Lord Melbourne, is very extraordinary. I mean, she's sort of in love with him in a sort of, well, I think, innocent way. And she sort of, her life revolves around him, and he adores her too. So there is this sort of rather touching relationship. And then, I mean, much later, Disraeli sort of does establish himself on a sort of incredibly warm personal relationship and flattering her, sort of absolutely outrageous.
Makes her an empress.
And
that
possibly,
always goes down well.
and some people felt indulging her much too much, and giving her an idea that, you know, she should wield more power than was perhaps proper. But sort of so. Aside from prime ministers, then obviously after Albert's death, then her Highland servant John Brown does establish this, you know, extraordinary relation. I mean, it's certainly an incredibly intimate friendship, which, you know, in itself was regarded as sort of extraordinary because he was, you know, a different class to her, and that. Actually, there's someone's just written a book, and I mean, really going the whole hog, saying that I mean, effectively they did have a sexual relationship, that she thinks they had a secret marriage. She even sort of seems to think that Victoria had a secret baby by him.
Oh, right, okay. I mean, I don't buy. We'll come on to the sex.
All that, but certainly she has uncovered sort of letters and things that do illustrate that Victoria, you know, I mean, and she writes to him as sort of darling one and my beloved and things. So, I mean, I think it is very, very extraordinary, and it attracted quite a lot of trouble at the time. I mean, people were worried, and it was talked about, sort of thing.
Okay, well, that's going to be your favourite. I was sort of racking my brains earlier to think, well, favourites in the reign of Elizabeth II. Obviously, when you do have a very long reign, you're going to have a lot of candidates. I mean, one of my favourite characters in the 70-year reign of Elizabeth II is her dresser, Bobo MacDonald, daughter of a Scottish train driver who'd been in the nursery when she was a little girl and stayed with her all the way through princess years, marriage, coronation, everything, and exercised this extraordinary power. Whenever Bobo was on the royal yacht, the crew of the royal yacht referred to her as the QE3, and it was always said, "Don't upset Miss MacDonald, or you'll ruin the Queen's day." And if any private secretaries wanted to try and, you know, the Queen was being a bit stubborn or wasn't doing what they wanted her to do, they would go to Bobo first. And Bobo once famously said to one of her private secretaries, oh, my wee girl's all spoilt, I'll sort her out. And she would. And the Queen was devoted to Bobo, Bobo was devoted to the Queen, and she lived out her days at Buckpal. And it's always said on Bobo's birthday, the Queen would take her breakfast in bed, which is rather sweet. So she was one candidate, but obviously, yeah, we're into constitutional prime minister territory, so who are her favourite prime ministers, that age-old parlour game. Clearly Winston Churchill has got to be a candidate. Possibly Alec Douglas Hume, very similar temperament, much loved. But I think if and there was Patrick Plunkett, often described as the brother she never had, who became her equerry, then her deputy master of the household, but was really just sort of ran the palace, knew how to run the palace the way that Elizabeth II loved, and was a great friend. Died very young, at just 51, but is the only non-royal buried in the Frogmore burial ground. But I think I'm going to plump for David Airlie, 13th Earl of Airlie, who was a great man who grew up with the Queen. They were the same age. He sometimes called him my twin. And as we'll come on to a little bit later, he really, when the monarchy did hit the skids, he was absolutely central to holding it together, keeping the show on the road. I think he was probably the favourite if in a modern context. But let's go back. Now let's get on to the sex. Come on. Helen, your favourite and Richard II. I mean, you know, did they?
People certainly speculated that they did. The chronicler at St Albans Abbey, Thomas Walsingham, did report rumours of an obscene intimacy between them and referred to the knights of Richard's household as being more knights of Venus than of Mars. I'm not completely convinced. I mean, the two of them, they were both married, Richard to Anna Bohemia and Robert de Vere to Richard's cousin, Philippa de Courcy, the daughter of his Aunt Isabella. And neither of those marriages produced any children. But at a key point when things were, in fact, getting extremely stressful and difficult and politically very dangerous for de Vere, he outraged the great nobility even more than he had already by sending off to Rome for an annulment from this royal wife that he'd had for all these years, and without waiting for a reply, marrying one of Queen Anne's ladies-in-waiting who had clearly taken his fancy. So I suspect that de Vere was pretty straight, but enjoying all the perks that came from being put on a pedestal by the king. In Richard's case, I suspect Richard was obsessed with the magnificence of his court. No amount of gold was ever too much gold when it came to interior decor or clothes or paintings for Richard.
And bathrooms, didn't you have any?
Bathrooms, obsessed with hygiene, yes, did a lot of royal building and was always putting in very lavish bathrooms, individual latrines en suite to new bedchambers in the palaces and so on.
He did like Cliveden.
He really would. And I suspect poor old Queen Anne, who knew that it was her duty to have a child and was trying to enlist medical help, trying to enlist the help of the Virgin Mary and St Anne through her prayers and so on, it was probably quite difficult to produce a child if you couldn't get your husband to touch you. And I suspect that might have been Richard's position, that actually he did adore de Vere, he loved his company, he valued his opinion and put his interests beyond anyone else's. And I suspect, therefore, that if Richard had allowed anyone to touch him in an intimate way, he would have wanted it to be de Vere. But I suspect that de Vere was able to maintain his position while happily seducing one of Queen Anne's ladies and so on.
And just on another point, take away the sex. What was his sort of peak moment as favourite? What was the moment when he was exercising absolute optimum power?
The mid-1380s, in a situation where the Knights of Venus rather than Mars becomes very pertinent, because there is war with France. We're in the middle, they don't know, it's the middle of what we call the 100 Years' War. Also war with Scotland, who will always make trouble in the north if the French are causing trouble in the south. And a huge expedition to the north is embarked upon in 1385. All the nobles rally. Poor old Richard, made to go on campaign in a way he absolutely doesn't want to. And the main thing he enjoys about this campaign is that he bestows noble titles on lots of the people who are with him, including the unprecedented title of Marquis of Dublin on de Vere. And the following year, when the French are gathering the greatest fleet since 1066 in preparation for invading England, Richard is paying no attention whatsoever, riding where possible in the opposite direction with de Vere at his side, and at a deeply unfortunate and provocative moment decides he's going to promote de Vere again with the absolutely unprecedented title of Duke of Ireland. The dukedoms have only just been introduced in England, and so far they have all been of royal blood. Edward III's sons are the only other dukes in the country, and suddenly this young whippersnapper. I wish I could tell you what he looked like. I'm so regretting that we don't have enough medieval portraits, but clearly he was pleasing to Richard, becomes Duke of Ireland, and that is a flashpoint. The combination of Richard not paying any attention to the French armada that's about to invade while ennobling his favourite even further is one of the things that ends up bringing them both to crisis
that's
point.
peak De Vere.
Peak De Vere.
Lucy, again, Duke of Buckingham, James I, was it, you know, a physical relationship? And secondly, what was the absolute sort of zenith of the Duke of Buckingham's tenure?
Well, King James was certainly passionately in love with Buckingham, and we know that because there was a time when Buckingham went off to Spain with Prince Charles, the Prince of Wales, and the king was writing letters to him all the time he was away. I mean, that's another extraordinary story, which I won't go into here, I don't think. But so James loved him. He addressed him as Steenie, because the Bible tells us that St. Stephen had the face of an angel, and King James thought that Buckingham did too. Or he addressed him as my sweetheart, or in one particularly tender letter, as my sweet child and wife. This was a very intimate relationship. We know that they shared a bed quite frequently. People did. That doesn't necessarily mean what you might think it means. But, you know, if the king wanted to sleep alone, he could. You know, it wasn't for shortage of beds. And I think that, I mean, actually, once the bedroom door is closed, do we ever actually know for certain what they're doing together? But whatever they were doing, it was extremely intimate and very pleasurable. And there's a particular letter from Buckingham, which I think makes it all very, very plain, in which he writes to the king a couple of years after the event and says, "Do you remember that night at Farnham Castle?" And then he sort of goes on a bit. And it's quite clear that whatever happened at Farnham Castle was, I mean, you know, exactly who did what to whom, who cares. It was great, and I was still thinking about it afterwards.
And beyond the bedroom, what was his? When do we get peak Villiers?
Well, I mean, to start with, he was the king's right-hand man, and the king called him my instrument. And the king liked to train up his favourites, and he did the same with Somerset, didn't he, of creating, as it were, he called him my tool, my instrument. He needed a kind of a right-hand man, a deputy. James was terrified of assassination, for very good reason. You know, he'd had that ghastly childhood that I mentioned. The King of France was assassinated in his lifetime. This wasn't a paranoid fear. So he liked to keep away from the capital as much as possible. He'd be in his hunting lodges in Royston or Newmarket. He adored hunting. And Buckingham would be at court. He'd be in Westminster, not very often because the king didn't like summoning Parliament, but occasionally. Or he'd be certainly in the Privy Council chamber. Buckingham was made a Privy Councillor very early, to the great distaste of the more elderly councillors. And then Buckingham would be reporting back to the king. So it was an intimate, personal relationship, but it was also a job. And Buckingham hadn't expected to get this close to power. He wasn't one of the great aristocratic families. And a lot of the hostility, the way that contemporaries wrote angrily about him, was based purely really on snobbery, because, you know, the Howards and the Seymours and the Percys, they expected their nephews to you know, be all around the king. But no, here was this, I mean, you know, Buckingham was the fourth child from the second marriage of a member of the country gentry, really nobody special. And he had immense power as the king's right-hand man. So that the relationship was a loving, tender, personal relationship, but it was also a working relationship. And Buckingham was good at that. And he was also good at remembering his place. I mentioned his good manners earlier. And that was crucial because King James was very sensitive to any kind of... He didn't like people forgetting that he was God's representative on earth. And so Buckingham never forgot that. And so he deferred to him. He didn't try to seize power for himself. He was always just the king's instrument and right-hand man. And that relationship worked very well. And so, actually, you ask about the peak. I think what amazed people at the time was that King James, in 1624, Buckingham became very ill, and King James spent hours at his bedside praying to God, saying, please, God, transfer this illness from my dear Steenie to me, because he, the king, couldn't bear the idea that Buckingham might die and leave him alone in the world. And not quite immediately, but only a few months later, poor James did die. And then what astonished all observers, and continues actually to astonish slightly later in the century, a lot of 17th century commentators said, this is just completely unheard of. Usually when the king dies, then that's the end of the favourite's career. But in this case, Buckingham becomes the favourite of King Charles I. And, I mean, you know, your relationship with your father's boyfriend can be quite tricky. But in this case, King Charles loved him in a different way, not in a romantic, erotic way, but I think more in the way that a very nervous, and Charles was extremely nervous, anxious, had a terrible stammer, and as his later career amply demonstrates, very bad at politics. And he looked to Buckingham like a sort of more glamorous, more confident elder brother whom he revered.
And just moving on, I'm conscious of the time. I think we've sort of talked a bit about sort of Sarah Duchess of Marlborough's sort of peak of her powers, but let's get the two of you, as you're both biographers, and let's get back to sex. In the film, Deborah, clearly, you know, they are physical. Do you still stand by that? And Anne, do you think? Let's have an argument on that front.
Well,
did they or didn't they?
I'm actually sort of rather naive. I mean, we're never thinking about sort of sex and history, and I'm sort of oh no. You know. And I mean, I don't believe that first of all that Anne and Sarah had one, although that is more of a possibility, I think. And then, I mean, very confusingly, when Sarah falls out of favour and she realises that she's been supplanted by Abigail, and then she goes to Anne and she starts accusing Anne of having a lesbian relationship with Abigail, and she sort of threatens to, she tries to sort of blackmail her. She says sort of, well, you know, the secret will get out and it will disgrace you. So, you know, but I mean, by that time, Anne was so unwell that it's really very, very difficult to imagine that she was having this sort of physical passion with Abigail. Or that's what I think. But you...
Well,
Deborah.
What sparked my interest? The whole story of The Favourite, the film, began when I read an excerpt, a tiny column in the Evening Standard that said, everyone knows that the Duchess of Marlborough was having it off with Queen Anne. And I thought, really? I know nothing about Queen Anne, and I sure didn't know that about her. So I did a bit of an investigation. And I read a lot. And as Anne says, the source material is a bit unreliable because it mostly comes from Sarah, so we don't really know. But there is a bit of a history to Anne in that when she was a princess, she fell in love with a girl called Miss Cornwallis, and her father, who was James II, had to get Miss Cornwallis chucked out of court because she was having such a strong emotional and probably a sexual effect on Anne. So there is that separate little bit of evidence. When it comes to Sarah and Anne, they were together. They grew up together. I think from the age of 10 and 5, they were together at court. When Anne was a princess, Sarah was her absolute best friend. Mary became queen, the elder sister of Anne, and Mary chucked Sarah out of court because she was such a huge influence. So what I'm saying is they were completely inseparable. I think it's entirely possible. They grew up at the court of Charles II, which was the most raunchy court you could possibly find. Anything went, and threesomes were the best. And I have no doubt that in that sort of 60s atmosphere, 1660s and 1960s, that a lot of stuff was going on that probably went on between Sarah and Anne when they were young. I agree with Anne that as Anne became queen and she became very ill, it seems unlikely. She certainly, in my view, fell in love with Abigail, and there was this incredible thing where she always gave them as lavish presents to her girlfriends, Blenheim Palace being the peak of that favourite. The other favourite, Abigail, got the most extraordinary diamond ring. And we know about this because Abigail sold it back to George I when he became king. He succeeded Anne and was paid £25,000 for it. She also set aside cash for her in a secret treaty which siphoned off money from the Asiento slave trade, and that went straight into Abigail's pocket. There are so many things she did for that girl. Does that mean they were having sex? I don't know, but she was certainly in love with her. That I know. Excellent.
Well, thank you for that. I think we sort of touched on John Brown, really. I mean, you mentioned the book. I mean, just quickly going back to him, if we got an example of him exerting any sort of real power. I mean,
well,
he could keep prime ministers at bay, couldn't he, if they were boring her and that sort of thing?
Yes, but it doesn't seem that he had much of a political role. I mean, the only thing I can think of was that he said of Gladstone's government, you know, we cannot have a worse lot than them. But I think, but he, I mean, there started to be trouble, and it was attracting comment that the relationship, and that there is a moment when the cabinet has to sort of discuss, because Victoria is about to appear, in theory, at a military review, and Brown is going to accompany her. And then there's a worry that a crowd, a sort of mob, will barrack him and sort of practically pelt him with stuff. And there's a tremendous to-do, and eventually the Prime Minister sort of says to Victoria, we don't quite know because the relevant sections of her journal have been destroyed, but he says, look, I think it's best he doesn't accompany you. And Victoria sort of agrees, but is then very, very annoyed that she's agreed, and thinks that it's, you know, she wishes she hadn't sort of deferred to the things. So I mean, there are political repercussions to the relationship, but I don't think he directly sort of wields power himself.
Right, well, coming back to my favourite Earl of Airlie, I mean, obviously nothing remotely physical about it. They were lifelong friends. His wife, Ginny, was a wonderful lady in waiting to Elizabeth II. But when it comes to, you know, the great, the sort of peak power, if you like, he was the man, David Airlie, was the man who did transform the royal household just when it needed to happen and so he was using that sort of, he was using both his friendship to bolster the authority he needed to change the court, but by golly, the court needed changing in the 1980s. Everything looked wonderful in the garden. Charles and Diana were the most glamorous couple on earth. Everybody loved the monarchy, but the finances were in a terrible state. David Airlie sorted all that out, so that by the time we hit the annus horribilis of the 1990s, and big problems arose about tax and having to raise money for the Windsor rebuild, it was in a much, much stronger place. But anyway, let's go, because we haven't got very long. I know we've got to get to questions. I haven't even gotten a downfall. In 30 seconds, tell us how it ended for each of your favourites.
Big political constitutional crisis. De Vere, driven into exile, spends a while rattling around in Paris and then in Louvain in the Low Countries, gets killed by a boar while hunting. And 3 years after his death, Richard manages to get his body brought back for reburial and has the coffin opened so that he can look one last time on De Vere's embalmed face and touch his fingers.
Oh, blimey. Right, OK. Lucy, what happens to Buckingham in the end?
Okay, King James was a pacifist, he kept the peace, but as soon as he's dead, Charles and Buckingham together, but really Buckingham with Charles's consent, start 2 unnecessary wars, one against France, one against Spain. Either would be madness, but this is double madness. It turns out that Buckingham is not a very competent military commander. These wars are unsuccessful. He becomes very unpopular. Actually, no. First off, he becomes very popular because, as often at the beginning of a war, people feel patriotic and excited, and they call him St. George on horseback. But then, the bodies start coming home and taxes rise because war is very expensive. And so the people start to hate him. Parliament tries to impeach him. The great Sir Edward Coke, the great jurist, stands up in Parliament and declares the Duke of Buckingham is the cause of all our miseries. And Buckingham has gone down to Portsmouth, where he's leading yet another expedition, ill-advised expedition against France, and an assassin called John Felton reads the text of Cook's speech. Felton thinks, OK, if he's the cause of all our miseries, I, Felton, can do my country a great service. He buys a knife, he walks to Portsmouth, he can't afford a horse, he makes his way into the Greyhound Inn, where Buckingham is having breakfast with his officers, and he kills the Duke of Buckingham with one blow to the heart.
Right, so there we go. It's a pub brawl that brings down this extraordinary 2-reign favourite. I'll come back to you, Anne, on Victoria in the end, but just tell us what the eventual downfall of both your favourites.
Right. Well, Anne sacks Sarah. She sacks Marlborough as her general. She sacks their best friend Godolphin, who is Lord Treasurer, which is the precursor to Prime Minister. Marlborough and Sarah are forced to go into exile. They have to leave England. They can't stay here. And they only are able to return when Anne dies in 1714, and they come back. The Hanoverians are very, very supportive of Marlborough and the Whigs, which is their party. But Sarah says she will never go near a court again, and I don't think she ever did. Abigail hung on, took everything she possibly could, exploited the Queen for everything she could possibly manage. She even got Anne to appoint her brother a general in Canada, who proceeded to lose his entire army. And this is after Marlborough being sacked, by the way. And at the end of her reign, she dies, and Abigail is never seen in a court again and never heard of again.
Fascinating. And Anne, briefly, John Brown.
Well, he for his entire lifetime, he is on incredibly close terms with Victoria. And then, sort of unexpectedly, dies of erysipelas, which is a sort of skin infection. And, it's like, there are always some reports that he had a bit of an alcohol problem. Other people sort of make out that this is terrible slander. But anyway, he does die very unexpectedly, pretty young, actually. And Victoria is very upset, although recovers perhaps slightly quicker than, certainly much more quicker than when Albert dies. So, right. But he's a favourite to the end.
He's a favourite to the end,
yeah.
And certainly that applies to David Airlie, who was a great man. In fact, one of the only people who was at the last coronation, and was at the 1937 coronation as well. Served the monarchy all the way through, and is much loved, and died 2 years after the Queen he served so well. So I think we had better go to questions, because I'm running over, although I'm enjoying the fact that there's no one coming in after us, so if we run on by a minute or two. Yes, I can see Andrew there. Lord Roberts of Belgravia, Festival Chair, yes.
Thank you. My question is to Anne. Is it true that Queen Victoria had a picture of John Brown put into her coffin, or at least she wanted to have a picture of John Brown put into her coffin, and Edward VII stopped it from happening?
I don't. She goes in her coffin. She's wearing the wedding ring of John Brown's mother, and the mother had bequeathed it to John Brown, and then he gave it to Victoria, and she, when she's buried, she's wearing. I mean, she's wearing her normal one, but she's also wearing this one, and the royal family are still sort of quite sensitive about it, because when someone wrote a book and then mentioned about the wedding ring, there was an attempt to sort of to block and put a stop to her using that piece of information, even though actually it had been published before, sort of thing. But they're still quite sort of nervous about it. I don't know about a photograph. I can't remember if that's there. But anyway, I mean, she certainly did show her fondness for him to the grave, sort of thing.
The lock of his hair in there as well, wasn't there?
Yes.
Yeah. Any other questions? Anybody? Yes, please, let me read.
Hi, thanks so much, everyone. Deborah, you've spoken briefly about how Abigail and Sarah were representing the Tories and the Whigs, respectively. And I wonder if you or anyone else would talk about whether favourites tended to come in kind of as the heads of factions that the monarchs were sympathetic to, or whether they were basically standalone figures and then the monarch might be won over to their politics as a sort of extension of that.
Can I, maybe Deborah, the political element of
Yes,
of favourite.
Anne was very much a Whig, although she
Sarah was.
Sarah was very much.
Yes.
Was Anne a Tory? I can't
Yes,
remember.
Anne was a Tory.
Anne was a Tory. Well,
Yes.
she didn't really
So
want to
that-
be ruled by factions, did she?
No, I mean, she would prefer to not let a single party become dominant.
Yes.
But she inclined more to the Tories. And, I mean, that is one of the problems that their political disagreements.
Yes.
And Sarah just kept saying sort of, you're idiotic. It's obvious that
Yes.
the Whigs are the party to support. So I mean, that it caused a lot of tension.
Yes, yes, she's absolutely right. I completely forgotten.
No, I was going to say, I mean, obviously, didn't really have political parties in either of your
Not
given
in the
courts,
same way.
but factions.
Certainly in the Jacobean court, it wasn't a matter of political parties because, as you say, they didn't exist. It was more a matter of sectarianism. And Buckingham, or George Villiers as he then was definitely brought to court and trailed before King James as a piece of sexual bait by a group of ultra-Protestant grandees, including the Archbishop of Canterbury, who hoped that if King James could fall in love with this pretty young man who they imagined they could use as a puppet, then they could, through this young man, they could influence James's foreign policy. What they wanted was for him to go to war with Spain. But it actually didn't work because it hadn't occurred to anyone that as well as a pretty face, Buckingham might have a brain. I think a lot of women throughout history have suffered from this. There's something you can't have pretty face and brain. And Buckingham turned out to agree with the King's peace policy and to very loyally help him enforce it. So it was a failed attempt to influence government.
And just lastly, can I ask each of you to maybe at the end, just in a nutshell, what for future court favourites, what's the thing they should have uppermost in their mind? What's your top tip for a would-be favourite? Helen.
Don't ignore it if the French are trying to invade.
Okay, very good. Lucy.
remember that your position is always totally precarious because it depends on one person's favour.
Yes, I mean, basically I would say stay on good terms with the sovereign sort of thing, which...
Don't speak truth to power.
Very good. Well, on that note, very good. Thank you very much indeed. All our guests will be through in the bookshop signing shortly. I don't know, Deborah, you know, we can sort of maybe sign a DVD of the favourite, perhaps. But thank you all very much. My guests, Dr. Helen Castor, Lucy Hughes-Hallett, Anne Somerset, and Deborah Davis. Thank you very much.